Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
What should we do about homeless encampments? Nobody likes to see a homeless encampment. I think we can all agree there shouldn't be tent cities in Canada. We should be able to do better than this. And yet encampments are a reality. They are a fixture now in basically every major city and large town across this country and have been for years now. And for years now, governments at all levels have been grappling with the best approach to dealing with them. And indeed, we have seen very different approaches across the country, some cities much more tolerant than others. In Vancouver, for example, there was a large encampment in a popular city park that was allowed to exist for almost 3 years before the city eventually dismantled it. In other places like Edmonton, local authorities have been much faster to evict people living on public land. Some of them go to shelters if there's space, others simply move on and continue living on the street elsewhere. Other cities have gone as far as to accommodate homeless encampments with municipal services, power, heat, washrooms, running water. We saw that in Halifax last year. But wherever and whenever tent cities pop up and grow, there is a common theme. Eventually, public pressure to do something forces government to act. Here in Canada's largest province, in Ontario, the Doug Ford government is taking a drastic step this week. It has tabled legislation that would empower municipalities to clear encampments faster and shield municipalities from lawsuits on behalf of the people they are evicting, the people living in tents on public land. The Ontario government didn't do that all on its own. Mayors have been demanding these powers. Mayors are responding to the demands of their residents, people who are fed up with the social disorder, the drug use, the crime that often accompanies large homeless encampments. It's a mess. It's a situation with no easy short-term fix. And the long-term fix is building an adequate supply of social housing. We know this. It will take years, if not decades. So what do we do? In the meantime, what do we do? What do we do about encampments? I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with Tim Richter, the CEO of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Hi, Tim.
Hi, David. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for making time to talk about this important issue. So, here in Ontario, Canada's largest province, the Doug Ford government is taking a pretty drastic step in dealing with homeless encampments, with tent cities. The government has tabled legislation that would expand the power of municipalities and local authorities to go in and clear encampments and displace people living there, and shield them from liability, shield them from lawsuits filed on behalf of the people who have been evicted. So what we're seeing here is a response to a lot of public pressure. I think fairly enough, mayors are hearing it every day from residents who I think rightly are uncomfortable with seeing tent cities. You know, Tim, I think everybody can agree we shouldn't have this problem in Canada, but we do. So as a jumping off point there, what kind of pros and cons are there to this action from the Ford government, this approach? Where is the balance in responding to public pressure, public concern, but also respecting the rights of people who don't have a home and acknowledging that, you know, once you clear that encampment, there may not be anywhere for them to go? What do you think about this approach of clearing encampments versus leaving them be?
Well, first of all, I think we need to kind of appreciate a couple of things. One, I think there's nobody more than the people in the encampments that want to not be in encampments. And, we can totally appreciate where the public's at. I think where we can all agree is that there needs to be an urgent resolution to these encampments, but there has to be an urgent and effective resolution to these encampments, which I think what Premier Ford is proposing will be the case. So first of all, I think we need to understand a couple of things. One is that, homelessness is a housing problem. These encampments we really started to see them as part of a product of a surge in homelessness we're seeing across the country. So since the beginning of the pandemic and through the cost of living crisis, we've seen a surge in homelessness in Canada where, there is we expect over 300,000 people will experience homelessness in Canada this year. And that kind of growth I don't think we've ever seen in the country. Um, but homelessness is a housing problem, right? And if you want to solve encampments, if you want to solve homelessness, you have to solve the housing problem. And so the key to resolving encampments is working with the people in them and trying to solve the housing issue. And that doesn't need to wait, 3 years until more housing is built. There's a lot of things you could do today to move people out of the encampments into housing or into a better indoor setup while they get into housing.
Talk to me about the approach that is considered best practice and what are some of the barriers to the success of that policy? I believe it's known as housing first. Is that right?
Yeah, housing first is kind of at the heart of the approach, and I think let's maybe I'll describe it better with a bit of an analogy. So, when I talked about 300,000 people experiencing homelessness in a year, that's larger than the largest natural disasters in Canadian history in terms of the number of people who've been unhoused. So you think, I'm calling in from Calgary, and in 2013, 77,000 people were forced out of their homes by a flood. 2016, 85,000 or so were forced out of their homes by a fire in Fort McMurray. None of those people are still homeless, right? And we have a lot to learn in this respect from disaster response. And in a disaster, if people are forced out of their homes, there's a system in place, where local governments lead, provincial and federal governments support. The focus is keeping people safe from the emergency or the fire or the flood, but then moving them back into their homes as quickly as possible. And we can use all of the same template that we use in disaster response. And that really is a housing first focus. And in the case of encampments, it starts with understanding the needs of the people in there. Who are they? What are they, what do they need in the same way as in a disaster? If you're forced out of your home, you go to a reception center and they figure out what you need and then help get you connected to temporary accommodation. And that can be shelter, but in a lot of places we're seeing temporary housing put up, like workforce housing we use here in Alberta in the oil sands, or shelter hotels like we did during the pandemic. So there's a way to create temporary housing to move people out of encampments quickly, but then have a process to move them into permanent housing. And what is being proposed by Premier Ford is to push people basically to nowhere, force them out of an encampment. All that means is they go to somewhere else in a community. They go to alleyways, they go to the woods, they go to any warm place that they can find. And then they get into more danger. So what the Premier is proposing only really scatters the issue, scatters people around, puts them into greater danger. It won't work, and it'll cost a fortune. So where we want to move is, as you say, a housing first approach that borrows from disaster management in how we would address it.
Okay, but at the same time, I think the Ford government would say this. This legislation, it's not compelling any municipality to act. It's giving them tools should they choose to act. And not every encampment is the same. We have seen situations, one that comes to mind for me is in Edmonton, where we saw people who were killed. There was organized crime preying on people, and the environment of an encampment facilitated that. And the Ford government may say we have a duty to respect these people's rights, but we also have an obligation to maintain public safety. And if giving municipalities the tools to act when they feel an encampment has gotten out of control, why should municipalities not have those tools?
Because they don't need them. They don't need them. Like right now, the police have all the powers that they need in order to deal with the organized crime and the criminal activity around these encampments. And to be clear, we have to be clear that the people in the encampments are the prey to these criminal predators, and we have to protect them. And so I think I've seen a lot of and this does happen for sure. And I've seen encampment resolutions where the police work in partnership with social services, work with the people in there. The police move in and deal with the criminal element and those that are around it, but social services works with the people in the encampment and helps move them into housing. And there's lots of examples of these sorts of things. So the municipalities don't need any other powers. What the powers that the Ford government wants to give to municipalities is to effectively use enforcement to push people in the encampments out without any obligation on the authorities to respect the rights of the people in these encampments. And I would argue it's completely unnecessary in order to resolve the kind of issue you described.
It is common, and it may be difficult for people to understand, but sometimes a person living in a tent in a park would rather be there than in the shelter system, even in the wintertime. Yeah. Can you talk to me a little bit about why that is?
Well, it often what we hear when we talk to people and you ask them, and part of the process of resolving an encampment is actually talking to people and say, well, why aren't you using the shelter? And what they'll tell us is it's unsafe. I'm scared being in there. I can't be there with my pet. I have a real struggle with addiction, and they won't let me be there unless I'm sober. Those sorts of things, and there's a lot of barriers there can be a lot of barriers in shelters. So I think often, especially for women or young people, the shelters feel and are can be unsafe for them, right? So again, the key to when people say, well, homelessness is a choice. If you think about choice, it's a choice between options, and I think it's not necessarily a choice as we think about it. But if you imagine what's going on in the shelter system, that sleeping outside is the better option. And part of resolving encampments means resolving the shelter system, resolving some of the challenges in the shelter system. Now, in a lot of communities, the shelters are full, right? So we have to be looking at some of these alternative measures. It may mean more temporary accommodation. It may mean some temporary expansion of the shelter system, but ultimately there has to be a movement of people into housing.
Yeah. Okay. So I'd like to ask you about some of those alternative solutions. So a lot of people may not really understand how the shelter system works. They may hear this ubiquitous term, the shelter system. It's really a patchwork, right, Tim? For example, here in Ottawa, where I am, we have some large shelters, and they do great work. They're funded 85 to 90% of their funding is donations, grants, things like that. They are charities. They're not getting a reliable stream of operational funding from any kind of level of government, be it the municipality or the province or the federal government. So is that shelter system similar across the country? Is it a patchwork, or are there places where they have a better approach than we do here?
It's typically a patchwork. One of the things that we work with communities on is building coordinated homeless systems. And if you go back to that disaster management analogy, One of the things that you have in a disaster response is a command center, like a municipal emergency response command center, and a municipal disaster response plan. And what we help communities do around the country is build that coordinated system so that we see in real time what's happening and we can connect all of the different parts. But you're right, typically in a lot of Canadian communities, the shelter system is a system in name only.
So why are we doing it this way? It would make sense to approach a homelessness emergency on an emergency footing the way that we do when there are floods, when there are forest fires. Why does that not happen?
Well, because we've allowed the homeless system to kind of grow up by accident, and we don't focus on solving the problem. Like if you see more people become homeless, we do what the premier's proposing. Well, there's more people experiencing homelessness, so let's build a shelter. Let's build all these additional programs onto it, as opposed to looking at a solution to the problem. Right? What the premier's proposing is, again, is a response to the symptoms of the emergency, not about solving the problem. And if you shift your focus toward solving homelessness, making it rare, brief, and non-recurring, you build something much more like a disaster response system. But it really comes down to, like, we want to build a housing-focused response. And what the premier's proposing and what has happened consistently around the country is this accidental not system that's not really a system of emergency responses and bolted together programs where the charities are forced to pick up from where government has failed. And what I would argue to the premiers, you want to create a system analogous to the disaster management approach that every city in Ontario, every city in Canada would have in place, right? So that municipal governments lead to build a coordinated response focused on dealing with the crisis, moving people rapidly into housing. The province supports, especially around creating new housing, creating new affordable and supportive housing, new housing first programs. And the federal government also supports in its areas of jurisdiction. But that isn't happening. And we continue to fall into this pattern of just this whack-a-mole crisis response, which costs a fortune, doesn't actually solve the problem, and leaves people forced to live in encampments.
Right. So on the issue of encampments, just to get back to the crux of the issue here, there seems to be this constant push and pull, this conflict between short-term action and long-term solutions. Action in the interim, long-term solutions. At the end of the day, what is the best approach to dealing with encampments? Is it to try to shut them down and as much as possible push people into a shelter system? Or is it better to take a more hands-off approach and essentially let them be and allow law enforcement to take the necessary steps when public safety becomes an issue? What is the best interim approach?
Well, if I were, I've had this conversation with a lot of mayors and councils around the country, and I said, well, if a fire or flood hit Ottawa tomorrow afternoon, God forbid, an ice storm or something, would you require people to camp in the park? You wouldn't. You wouldn't, because there's a process in place, right? There's a system in place to move people rapidly into housing, right? And I'd argue you can do the exact same thing here, right? And you can accommodate people with appropriate supports in temporary housing. It could be a hotel. When there was the fires in Kelowna in 2003, my parents were evacuated. They went to a reception center and they said, Frank and Denise, what do you need? Where do you live? Do you have your medication, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Here, tell you what, we're going to put you up in the Delta Hotel for a couple of nights until we can get you back in your home. And some of their neighbors who lost their homes, the city worked with them to find longer term accommodation, rented, another rental house or whatever their insurance was able to provide. So there is a solution. We're just choosing not to treat homelessness like the disaster it is.
So, brass tacks,
Yeah.
if we're being honest, if we're looking at reality and not simply aspiration, should Canadians expect that encampments will be a feature of major cities for the short term, the medium term, I don't know, 2 to 4 years as we work through a better way to do this? I mean, if somebody listening in the region of Waterloo is wondering what's going to happen with that encampment, what should we tell them?
Only if governments choose not to act. If governments chose to act, I think within 12 to 18 months, encampments could be very rare in most communities in Canada.
Right. So if somebody listening in Waterloo, listening today, in 12 months from now, if nothing has happened, if we are in the same exact situation, that's a lack of political will. That's a lack of political will.
That's exactly what it is, yes.
Okay. In closing, just to turn the floor over to you, do you have any closing thoughts for this discussion, messages, things you'd like people to take away from the show today?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, homelessness is solvable. I think encampments, there is a resolution to them. What Premier Ford is proposing will be ineffective, expensive, and ultimately harmful. But there is an approach, and we can learn from disaster management on what to do with it, what to do about it. But I think everybody can agree that we need to find a resolution to encampments. People do not belong living in parks. And what the premier says, you agree with, we want to have parks and public spaces available for people to enjoy. And frankly, no one wants that more than people that are stuck living in tents. I talked to thousands of people who've experienced homelessness over the years, hundreds of people who are living or have lived in encampments. And, I go back to, one of my earliest interactions with somebody living outside. I remember going out with Outreach, and they said to him, this fella, that he and his partner had been living in a cardboard box in the Beltline of downtown Calgary for years. And I remember walking up to him and saying, well, have you talked to Outreach? Have you talked to service? Oh yeah, they're great. They give me blankets. They give me water. They give me coffee. They're really great. And I said, well, we had got some apartments together. And I said, well, could we interest you in housing? He said, dude, I live in an effing box. Yes, you can interest me in housing. Right. And that, I think we've got to focus on the permanent solution to the problem, right? Housing is the only known cure to homelessness. There is no enforcement solution.
Tim Richter, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you joining us on the show. An important conversation.
Thanks, David.
Again, that is Tim Richter, CEO of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. He believes in 12 to 18 months with the right amount of political will and applying some of the best practices that we know work to deal with homelessness. Homeless encampments could become an exception, a rarity, rather than the rule. Again, the Ford government here in Ontario has tabled that legislation to give municipalities more legal cover to move in and clear those encampments. It's not expected to pass until the new year. We'll continue to follow that file closely for you here on The Big Story. I am David Smith. That's all for me today. Thank you so much for listening. A reminder about the Seeker app. It's the best way to listen to The Big Story. Radio, podcasts, all in one place. A great new listening experience. The Seeker app. That's spelled S-E-E-K-R. You can get that for Apple or Android. App Store, Google Play. Seeker, S-E-E-K-R.